Sure will. Mayor Studebaker is away tonight, so Council President O'Neill is presiding. You're here. Councilors Mans. Here. O'Neill.
Here.
Lamont.
Here.
Wynn.
Here.
Wendland.
Here.
Kohlhoff.
Here.
Can we stand for the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. I don't see anyone here, but we are waiting for one citizen, which will allow them to speak when they show up. So I'm guessing we can start the study session, and when Mr. Ornsby shows up, we'll give him a little time.
Good evening, councilors. My name is Jessica Numanalu. I'm with the Planning Department. And the study session that I'm going to cover today is on Resolution 438, which is the policy that was adopted by the City Council in 2004 to discourage the destruction of natural resources or removal of significant trees prior to annexation to the city. Because the city has a higher level of protection than the county does for natural resources and trees, that can incentivize some property owners that are in the county to remove trees or alter resources prior to annexing to the city for the purposes of increasing development opportunities on the site. And so this policy was adopted specifically as a financial deterrent to removing or altering resources prior to annexation. What it allows the council to do is defer annexation for up to 3 years if found to be in violation of the policy, require payment of restoration fees, and require mitigation to be maintained for 3 years prior to annexation and then 2 years after annexation. And then I would just point out that the council can, at its discretion, exempt any property from this policy if it so chooses. Overall, the policy appears to be serving its purpose as a pretty significant deterrent to discouraging tree removal and resource destruction prior to annexation. Since the policy is adopted in 2004, we've had 5 annexations where the policy has been reviewed or applied. Of those 5, 3 of them occurred in the mid-2000s, not long after the policy was adopted, and it turned out that the tree removal or resource alterations occurred prior to the adoption of the policy, so they technically didn't apply to those 3 annexations. However, I do note that 2 of the property owners did end up doing some mitigation, although not to the actual standards of the policy. The other 2 annexations where it was applied to occurred in 2014 and 2019. The 2014 one is the only one where we've actually applied the full policy. In that case, they removed trees and altered resources, and that annexation was denied because the owner declined to provide the mitigation or to pay the restoration fees. The most recent one was this last summer, and which is what prompted the review by staff of this policy per the council's request. In that case, there was tree removal that was found to have occurred prior to 1998, so well before the policy was adopted. Staff was able to determine that by visiting the site. There was pretty old tree stumps, and based on aerial photographs determined that the tree removal occurred well before the policy. So in that case, the policy didn't apply and the annexation was approved, but that did prompt the council to look at whether or not the resolution needed to be updated. So because the policy hasn't been updated in more than 15 years, at the work session today, we're going to look at 4 main updates that the staff has identified, which were discussed in the council report that you received along with a copy of the resolution. And I think it would be easier to go through each one individually, although our discussion here would really just focus on the first 2 because those really have the policy issues. The other updates are pretty routine updates, but I'll give you an overview of them and see if you have any comments or direction on those as well. So we'll start with the time frame for applicability of the policy. As I stated before, the policy was adopted in May 18th, 2004, so over 15 years ago. And the policy applies from the date of adoption. And so if you leave it as is, that time frame will continue to increase over time. So in 5 years, we'll have to look back 20 years at whether or not trees or resources were altered, in 10 years, 25 years, et cetera, and so on. And this becomes increasingly more difficult for staff to really determine whether resources were altered or trees were removed. Our current methodology is we do a site visit, and of course, if we see any tree stumps, that would clue us that there's some issues, or if we see a resource and it looks like it's been altered, we can look at aerial photographs back to, I think we have until 1998, although some of the earlier aerial photographs are not the best quality. And then we can also, if there is an inventoried resource on the site, we can compare the site to the description in the resource inventory that we have on file with the city. So that would be our methodology for determining whether or not there has been any violation of the policy. So staff has identified 2 options for the council to consider for the time frame for applicability. The first one is what staff would recommend, which would be to specify a specific time frame that the policy would apply from, that would apply from the date the annexation petition is filed. The recommendation is 10 years. So if somebody filed an annexation petition today, we would look back 10 years from today to see if there were any resource alterations or tree removal that had occurred. And the advantage of this is I think it still serves as a pretty significant deterrent because if someone wants to develop their property, it's usually a quicker time frame. So 10 years back is going to be a pretty significant deterrent. And as discussed in the report, I also found from the National Association of Home Builders that the average tenure for a home buyer of a single-family home is about 13 years. So that would fall within the tenure of most single-family homeowners. So that is one option. The second option is, of course, to just leave the time frame as is. And the issue, as I stated before, is that a longer time period, it just becomes more and more difficult to determine whether resources were altered or trees removed as time marches on. It could be argued to be a stronger deterrent for some of the long-term owners, people who plan to be there for longer than 10 years, or for folks who are located so far from sewer lines that city sewer that they just don't see annexation as being feasible in the near future. However, I would argue that even the current policy, leaving it as is 30 years out, is probably not going to make a lot of difference for those types of long-term home buyers. If they just don't want to annex into the city or don't see themselves ever annexing, whether it's 10 years or 30 years, it may not be a deterrent for those types of homeowners. And so I would welcome any feedback or questions or comments you have on those options.
Councilor Lamont.
Thank you, Council President. If I got this right, when I looked at the chart, there was February 2014, which is the freshest one. I think it's in the domain of most staff here, or at least some staff. And so this person took 7 trees out of a resource protection and then 84 trees removed from the RP and RC districts, 1 tree damaged. So when I think of it, if somebody doesn't know the law and they live in the county and they take a tree down or something, that's not a big deal. But this is pretty bad. So the question was, the $153,000 in the restoration fees, they had to pay the $139 per tree taken out, I think was the fine per tree, and then you got to put stuff back in. How did it get to $153,000?
So the restoration fee, it's actually not $139 per tree. And I'll talk about that, and that's our current type 2 mitigation requirement. If you can't mitigate on site, then you can choose to pay into the tree fund, which is $139 per tree. For the restoration fees, when there's a violation, that's where this came from, and so they just adopted what our restoration fees are. For a standard restoration fee, it's based on the caliper or the diameters in inches that were removed. So it's $90 per inch for the standard and $174 per inch for the increased fee. And an increased fee would apply, the code specifies a number of circumstances, but in this case, it would be a tree that's over 36 inches in diameter, or if a tree is located within a sensitive lands district, then it would be subject to the increased fee.
So if someone took 10 out wrongly, however that is determined, So it'd be $90 per inch of what they took out when you add it all
Correct.
up. And then the 100 and something was?
174 would be the increased restoration fee if that applied.
And so all that added up to 153,000.
Correct.
So this might be a Director Cross or David, our attorney question. Is this a lien on their property? So if they came into the city for whatever reason, bad septic or whatever, they have to pay us 153,000 before they could come in?
And I just stepped in, talking
Oh,
about the
sorry.
restoration fee, that doesn't create a lien on their property. That's a fine amount that would be imposed by the municipal court if they were within the city. And that's why the requirement of the policy is that they pay that before coming in and annexing, if I'm catching the context here correctly.
Yeah.
So they could argue, hey, we don't care, we don't want to come into the city, and they could sit there. But if the sewer goes, knowing we have a little more discretion on the sewer, they could come to us and say, uh-oh, now we got to get the sewer. It could be a new owner comes and says, we want to come in. Well, we have to go back to the file and see this, that there's a violation on file.
Right.
That has to be cured.
And it's the council's discretion
Yeah.
if you apply that. But yes, you could require them to pay that fee.
Thank you.
Counselor Kohoff?
So I have a question, but I wanted to tell you that I was aware of the backstory, as people who've lived here a long time are, for this policy. And that was, I happen to know, outside of anything else, what the nature of that area and the potential buyer who was eyeing those trees. And the long and the short of it is, one morning we get up and the trees are gone. I call up Stephen Lashbrook, who was the development director at the time, I believe. And I said, they're gone. And what happened? And he said, well, the night before, the people came on the property with an arborist and a logger. And that very night, they decided those trees were imminent danger, and down they went. And that was pretty amazing. It was not an oopsie. It was pretty much, from what we can see, intentional. So my question is it built in where there's some motivation, or we could have plenty of evidence that the motivation was to, in fact, get rid of trees that were more likely to be out under the county rules versus the city rules? Is there built into our thinking this motivation of whether it was like, is Councilor Lamont's referring to, where you didn't know you were going to develop, or you didn't know that your septic was going to fail, or whatever it was, and you went about taking care of your property as you saw fit, and then you tried to get annexed. Is there a distinction built in there for motive for doing it? Do you see what I'm getting at? There was
Yeah.
just absolutely no
Right.
doubt whatsoever for the policy as it was enacted in what we have right now, why it is as heavy-handed as it is.
Well, I don't recall, I mean, I've read through the entire policy several times. I don't recall there being any distinction between the motivation. In fact, in looking at the minutes and the prior council reports, there was a specific intention to make sure that it applied regardless of whether a homeowner did it and then somebody else bought the property later, and then just said, well, I had nothing to do with this, making sure that they would still be accountable even if a prior property owner did it. So I don't think there is a distinction in that resolution.
As it relates to that, then I would like that to be noted, that where it is intentional, some kind of heightened analysis. I'm not sure how you want to approach that. I don't want it to be necessarily punitive, but I know why they did what they did, and I thought it was a situation that clearly called for the policy that we have enacted. I get it about as time goes on, it gets to be less and less good to let it just float like that. That I'm not arguing that.
try to clarify that. So you want the policy to apply differently to intentional acts versus non-intentional?
Actually, I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not. What I don't want is if there is something about that policy that is addressing what it was set out to be, which was pretty much an intentional act to get around our laws and the developer wanted to get annexed and knew exactly what they were doing and how they did it, because act first and ask permission second. Then I want that to stay. I don't want it to be ameliorated.
Oh, okay.
I get it that 153,000 sounds like a lot of money, but I can also tell you 84 trees, pretty astounding.
Councilor Mance?
Yes, I have a couple of questions. The first of which is, since this law has been passed outside of the examples that are cited, how often do we encounter this on our regular onesie annexations that we do? Have we encountered this, or has this law, this code, become a deterrent?
Well, we have the 5 examples of
Right.
where it's specifically applied, but, we communicate. So anytime someone comes in to ask about an annexation at the counter, or they come in for a pre-app to possibly annex, we let them know about the policy. A copy of the policy is with the annexation application. It's also online. So it is communicated, and given that it's only arisen in 5 application cases, or annexation cases, I would assume that it is serving as the
I see, so
deterrent.
that's a sum total of
Right.
what's arisen.
Yes.
The second part of that question, I think you kind of touched on that, is the education component, both amongst residents, for example, which is a little bit more tricky.
Yeah.
Obviously, those who are developing in the city of Lake Oswego are probably very aware of our tree code and know the code behind that. What do we do as far as educating citizens that this in fact could happen if you take trees down within a certain time before development happens?
Well, we don't, other than, if people come into the counter and are asking about annexation, the planners would notify them or let them know about this policy. But we don't have any active educational efforts where we're just generally sending out notices or somehow educating people in unincorporated areas outside of if they come in and ask. You're right that builders and developers that are, work in the city regularly, I have personally gotten phone calls from them asking about, I want to remove this cherry tree. Do you think this is going to run afoul of the annexation? And and a lot of them are very careful about that, and they'll call and ask before they remove any trees in the county. But to answer your question, no, we don't have any specific efforts that is educating or notifying just regular homeowners that are in the county of this policy.
I'd like to make a suggestion that perhaps at some point there's some liaising with Clackamas County so that in whatever they're communicating, they might put that into, I don't know, I think they have a weekly or a monthly paper of some kind, or emails, something that people are aware of this. And then third and last, thank you for your patience, everyone. In certain cases, people may take a tree down in that shorter time frame, or several trees, not thinking that they're going to sell. There may then be a death in the family and a family squabble over property, et cetera, and it gets sold, say, to a developer. Does that then fall to the discretion of the city manager if there were some question as to that, or would it come before council if trees were taken out in that lesser time, or would it automatically be punitive, depending on the situation?
So if someone removes a tree, one of the options that's outlined in the policy is they can come to the city now and they can come in and see if they would be allowed to remove the tree if they were in the city under the current tree code. And if we find that they could, then we can document that, and then when they come up for annexation later, then they can show that they would
I
have been
see.
allowed to
So there
remove
is
the
a
tree.
mechanism.
There is a mechanism
Okay.
for them to do that. I don't know that anybody's ever done that. I'm not aware of it if it has occurred, but that is built into the policy.
You do know now that I've said that someone will. I'm kidding. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you for
and
your
I just, one
patience.
other follow-up is, the annexation is always at the council's discretion.
Right.
So I believe that they could decide not to do the full mitigation requirements or some
Yes, and the council
other
has.
version.
The one thing that legal counsel would advise is that it not be completely arbitrary, so that the council would articulate as to why you're not going to impose the full penalties and so forth. But Other
Absolutely.
than that, you do have that discretion under the terms of the policy.
Counselor Wedlin, you're up.
So what happens if it's like a situation where it's, I forgot what you call the annex term, but like we did over at Cruiseway where we annexed in a bunch of people?
Island?
The island annexation. What if they get islanded? Well, and they're forced to come into the city, and 5 years ago, they decided that they were gonna put a shed up or something and knock down 5 trees. I mean, how does that work?
Well, the policy specifically says that it does not apply to forced annexation, specifically because they didn't want the perverse incentive to have someone go in and purposely destroy trees and resources for the sole purpose of avoiding being annexed into the city. So in
Okay.
that case, it wouldn't even apply to those situations.
Okay. And then the only thing is, so you're saying, I don't know, do we have discussion on 1, 2, and 3? I mean, I think your 10-year thing is a pretty good idea, because to go back successively more and more years, there's going to be, that's going to be very difficult to manage and track. So I think your 10-year suggestion is very good.
Counselor Lamont?
I'm kind of in the same boat as the first thing would be the timing. I think you've recommended us, this is a better time frame for both incentive, deterrent, and staffing. The second thing would be just to make it easy on staff, whatever's easiest to get through, you having to assess the site. And, having to dig through and under the doghouse and everything to find old stumps, that's a little hard 25 years later. And then the third thing is back to what I think Councilor Kohlhoff is and where I was trying to dig around. I don't think we should be so outlandish with the fees, but again, a couple of bucks per tree, it's kind of, I'll take them down and then I'll just pay this as part of the cost of selling the land. So I don't know what the number is, the dollar amount is, but as long as it's a deterrent, that's going to be a cost to do this. If someone has a problem with a tree and they come in and talk to us, fine. But I've found that sometimes people wink and say, oh yeah, sure, that's a cheap little fine and I'll just do it and clear cut the whole site. I'm sure Director Cross would like to do a presentation on the fines and the fees right now, but we'll save the time. But I just think if you're going to come back to us with an ordinance, is that right, or a redo of the policy, that just take a look at that, make sure you think we're doing the right thing. It's not too heavy, it's not too light.
Counselor Wynn?
Yeah, so on the particular property that Councilor Cole was talking about, I want to know more about that particular one with 84 trees. And so I just did a Google search to see on that particular address, have they further developed that besides cutting down the trees? Have they actually have they subdivided, or have they started building on that lot at all?
No, they originally, that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to divide the property, and they already put a house in the back, a pretty significant house in the back, which was intended to be hooked up to sewer, which of course it's not because it hasn't been annexed into the city. So as far as we know, they're just going to leave it out in the county and not annex into the city, in which case they cannot divide and cannot hook up to sewer.
But if we were to implement a 10-year look back, at this point, they're halfway through there, so if we wait 5 more years, then are you saying that if we did implement that 10-year look back, this was 2014,
Yeah.
it's been 5 years since then, so if they wait another 5 years, they're past the halfway, and could they come back in 5 years and say, now we want to annex? Would that be allowable?
I think they technically could, yes.
If
I have a
you
problem
change
with
the
that. I
time
mean,
period,
I just feel like that's, I just almost feel like.
Unless that they're on record and we say no. I don't know if we can legally do that.
Well, it depends what your policy says. I mean, if you're changing the time period, that would apply to all unless you're going to say, people who've been denied annexation under the policy will be permanently denied until they comply with other terms of the policy. That would be, I suppose you could say that. I guess there'd be a little bit of an equity issue there for you to consider. Is that fair? If someone can intentionally cut down their trees and anticipate, probably change policy to 10 years, someone could say, well, I won't be annexing for 10 years, but I want to worry about trees, down they come. So they can do that. In some ways, if someone who wasn't allowed in under the 15-year policy, the 10-year runs, that might be an equitable thing to do. That's the downside of shortening the time period. If someone's that forward thinking or is willing to wait out their time, then in they come.
I think in this particular case, if it's already documented, they've already violated the ordinance, that should have some play into when we go to reconsider. If they go applying the annexation again, that should be part of the consideration, right? Because it's like
It would be.
would it? I mean, how do we make that into the part of the ordinance so that that we don't have something just wait out, it's a waiting game, if you're saying that there's a 10-year building cycle, right? So maybe somebody could have the patience and the foresight to say, well, in 10 years' time, when we're in a downturn now, we'll just cut all the trees down, and I know in 10 years, I could divide this into 5 lots or something. I mean, do we have anything that we can do to kind of safeguard against that? Again, I know that this is probably a gross example of that, but I think we don't want to have more of these types of examples where they took a risk, they cut them all down, and then depending on a new council, a new administration, they may relax those ordinances.
Why can't we get the county, because I know that maybe not Clackamas, but I know Multnomah County has abided by some of the rules and regulations that Portland has in unincorporated areas that, like ours, where the city surrounds everything, but we have all of these patchwork. Why can't we work with Clackamas County and if there's a home, although it's in the county, but it's in our city.
Service boundary.
Yeah. Why can't they abide by our rules and regulations?
Well,
I mean, I think that solves everything if that happens.
we would need to adopt county code that mirrored our rules and regulations.
We're not saying all of Clackamas County has to, but just the properties within our
They could.
perimeter.
Yeah,
No,
you
I
could.
know in Multnomah County, they do that.
They defer to the city.
Yeah, you could ask the county to adopt a mutually supportive, consistent ordinance that would impose the city's requirements under the tree code, for example, but with the county having jurisdiction for those unincorporated properties. There are other jurisdictions where the standards are one and the same. If you're in an urban area, whether you're in the city or the county, in fact, some cities actually administer land use in their counties, so
Right.
it could be explored. It would take some
We
work.
could do that
Yeah.
too as well.
It can
So
be
our-
asked, I'll just remind that when there was that annexation effort, the Chapter 195 annexation effort, that was strongly opposed by many of the urban service boundary areas, one of the main reasons, at least for some of them, was the city tree code, and fought it vociferously. And in fact, the city council decided not to go ahead. That doesn't mean you can't ask, but I imagine the county then, if they were to impose the same requirements, including cutting for views and other such things, I think they would encounter the same sort of opposition, but you never know, it's been a while.
It is one, among the reasons that some unincorporated areas do not want to annex.
That's right. But again, I'm not saying that can't be done. It's just a caution that it
Councilor
might not be
Lamont?
So if we take
uncontroversial.
Councilor O'Neill's thought process there, the next step. So if we did that, and somebody knocked on the door and said, I want to build a new house, an expansion, put up an ADU, do a tree thing, they would be told at the county, you're in the urban growth management of Lake Oswego, you go over to Lake Oswego for administration, like Portland does for parts of Multnomah. That would be, our whole code would be applicable then, is that correct? No?
Well, that would be.
You could.
that would
They
be a
do it
pretty
that
Yeah,
way.
they do it that way, yeah.
extreme model, but really, the county has jurisdiction. It's just a question of what standards has the county adopted for those areas that are within the urban services boundary. And, some jurisdictions have a planning requirement that if you're dividing land in the urban services boundary, it has to be divided in a way that the city can extend its utilities at some point, and that the streets line up. And we don't have those requirements. land use pattern in the county is not a street grid. It really wouldn't, provide for that.
But when we had that annexation question on Goodall, I think it was, that court that has no parking, and we got caught between the county and city, the inefficient zoning and planning stuff, you were explaining that night, Director Siegel, that the county, I think, goes from the center line of the road when there's setbacks, and we go from the setback, or the right-of-way. It was very confusing. Wouldn't it be better for us and for you, and we don't have to answer it completely tonight, if we just said, no, we want that to be anybody in our urban services that were there, they come in for our code. I just finished a project in Portland, and we had to, Multnomah County said, go over to Portland and deal with the code and them. This is an idea that may have some merit, so we're all even Steven in our whole urban growth boundary without gaps and going to middle of the road rather than right-of-ways, et cetera.
At this point, we have a hard enough time just getting communication back and forth when the county has an application for a septic replacement. We do communicate on that level because they'll ask if the city's able to provide sewer. And that's an opportunity to communicate the resource conservation
But doesn't
requirements.
Clackamas County just recently have a new person in charge?
Right.
Yeah,
Planning.
so I mean, this would be a good time
We
to
can certainly ask them if they would be
sit with
willing,
somebody who
consider- they may-
doesn't have all of this prehistory with them.
Yeah. And there may be other things, the police and sheriff stuff that we keep harping on, and maintenance and whatnot. And we've talked informally with county commissioners about it. I think we just haven't gone informally with the manager and sat down and talked about it. That would take a lot of confusion out of our urban growth area, I think.
Counselor Mance?
So looping back to the county and what my colleagues have said, I think the direction that I'd like to see is some sort of work between county staff and our staff to see if there's something that can be done around this subject, amongst others. Speak at will for what you want. I also think 10 years is a reasonable amount of time. It does become harder and harder, and tree stumps disintegrate at different rates. I understand all of that, but certainly there's some movement to be had with the county working with us.
And I feel like I didn't get a chance to address Councilor Nguyen's comments about what can we do for these properties. In particular, we just have the one that had an actual violation of the policy. And if they wait another 5 years, then they could annex into the city. The answer is yes, and I guess the policy wouldn't technically apply if it's been more than 10 years. And I guess the way you get around that is having a longer time frame, or you could just leave it as is, in which case it would just apply to from 2004 on. But again, there's trade-offs because it becomes harder to, in that case, it's easy because it's documented, but I suppose you could put in there that if there was a violation of the policy specifically at any time.
If they
Well,
were
I mean, if
record.
they were denied annexation
Right.
because of the policy, they have an extended period, they might come back and say, so what I did wrong was applying for annexation. I mean, my neighbor could have cut the same number of trees down, not applied, and come in 10 years,
Yeah.
And again, I'm not arguing their case, but that's the trickiness is, how do you make it equitable if you're going to do that? And I tend to agree with Ms. Namanalu, which is if 10 years is too short, it's too short. But whatever period you make, someone can, one day beyond that, say, well, I want to annex in 10 years, 12 years, whatever it is, mow the trees down, and the policy doesn't apply. So that's the difficult trade-off. Unless you want to make it a longer period.
Counselor Kohab?
So I'm good with going in there with the county. I get it that sometimes in the past that things haven't been as collegial as they should be now, and we should expect to go forward in a collegial way and readdress these problems. I'm still wondering why we would have to make any rules retroactive. So maybe we just say, okay, as it relates to the one with the 84 trees, maybe we start there, statute of limitations, the day we enact this policy, and then they have another 10 years or something of this nature. But I'm kind of with Councilor Nguyen. I'm not really anxious to, let intentional situations go. So we can work on that. I'd like to flip, and the 10 years otherwise is fine. I'd like to, though, if we can, did you want to talk about the cost per tree or did you want to give us a little
on one first.
presentation?
Yeah.
Were you going to come back and then give us a further presentation on the fees? So that I wait on my questions on that?
So the restoration fees, I mean, that's the only thing that would apply, is the restoration fees, except for, well, I shouldn't say that. If they had a water resource on their property that was subject to state or federal laws but wasn't an inventoried resource, then they would be subject to any fees or fines that the state or federal agencies might require, and our policy requires that those fees be paid before they annex into the city. Of course, if the city doesn't get them, it would be the federal or state agencies. But other than that, it's just the restoration fee. That is in our fee schedule, and it is, the current fee is $90 per inch of tree removed, or $174 per inch tree removed for the increased fee.
So I didn't get
That's
the
what it's
increase.
based on.
The increased fee is what? So if they took them down, so the calculation would be $170 times the trees. I'm not getting why 90 to 170.
Okay, so 90 is the standard. 174 per inch applies to increased fees in any of the following circumstances. This is actually in our tree code. If you remove a tree that is 36 inches in diameter or greater, if you remove a heritage tree, if you remove a tree that's expressly protected or required to be preserved as a condition of approval, if it's located within the Willamette River Greenway, or if it's part of an RC, RP, or HBA district, or if it's located within a public right-of-way, city-owned or dedicated property, or a public or private open space area or conservation easement. Those are the circumstances where we would apply the
I
174
got it. So it's a special tree situation.
Yes.
Okay.
Counselor Wynn?
So did I just hear you say that, so if there's any fees or sanctions that are imposed by the state or by federal, meaning natural resources, those would remain, right? Those are expected to be paid by the property owner when they come to annex, is that correct?
Right, but the policy says that we will not annex them until they pay those fees.
Okay,
to-
and that's
to
just
those
for the federal
agencies.
state, but why can't we make it also a requirement that we pay the city part of it too, right? Because I mean, for example, they cut down the trees, that's the money that the city charges or it fines the property owner, right?
Right.
So in the same way where, you know, we would uphold what the state and what the federal would fine the property owner.
Right.
We should do the same thing for our city rules too, right? Why would we give up on the city fines yet enforce the federal and the state fines?
Right.
Well, we do the city fines, but we're talking about people who aren't in our city cutting trees down, and then how do we deal with them when they want to come into the city?
Right.
Well, they come in, they pay the fine, right?
Yes, but then we start talking, well, what if it's 10 years from when they created are they? do we still charge
That's what I'm trying to get at, is
them?
that, you know, I don't feel like, just because you've committed the infraction, right? That doesn't go away, that remains, and you've got to cure that infraction. So if it's been determined that you've had that violation of that ordinance, that remains. It doesn't get automatically waived after 5 years or 10 years. I mean, that's where I'd like.
Two things there. One is it's 10 years from now on for everybody coming or not coming in. But then some of these folks on record, do we still keep them on record as saying, hey, you didn't cure it? Forget the 10 years, you got to cure it at the fine level that they were given the fine.
Equal protection problem?
Could you, I can't, yeah, sorry.
Don't you have an equal protection problem if you did that? If you have similarly situated property owners and you treat somebody differently just because
David,
you,
well,
because they
that-
thumbed your nose at you in the
It
past?
wouldn't be a suspect classification for equal protection, but it would be a distinction that's made where you have to have a rational basis, you know, so not the high level, but yes, there has to be some reason why you're singling them out and not someone else. And so I think some of and I would agree with that. And again, one difference is it's not really a fine that as if they broke a city code, they get a citation, and that fine stays until they pay. They're not in the city. What they're saying is the city council will accept your annexation if you agree to pay a sum that would equal the fine if you'd done that. So then, as the city manager says, so what's equality? And I know it seems funny to say, well, these people who were rejected for annexation 5 years ago, should they be home free in another 5? Well, again, the equity issue is, as I said before, their neighbor cuts down the same number of trees 10 years ago, but doesn't apply for annexation, so is never rejected, then applies in 10 years. And the first person might say, well, wait a minute, so the only thing I did different from this guy is I applied for annexation, and you said no. So I guess we'd have to be able to articulate, I agree with the city manager, why are we making that distinction? What's this person done differently from that one, other than applying for annexation?
The equity question, I mean, Martha's hitting right on the head, yeah.
And I guess I would only reflect that 10-year, I find it unlikely that anybody's going to hang on to a property for 10 years. 10 years is the penalty then, right?
Right.
The penalty is the delay in your ability to develop your property. So I agree that it doesn't feel right with this particular property owner, but at the same time, the price that property owner is paid is having to wait. And so I don't know if you find that persuasive or not, but that would be, I don't think you can create a standard where you say the 10 years applies to everybody except for this one case. I can't think of a rational public policy reason why you could single them out.
And in a way, they didn't violate any laws, they just violated your annex, you wouldn't agree to annex them, So the problem, once again, if they're bad guys, if they violated county
Correct me
standards.
if I'm wrong, that wasn't really the cleanest deal where one guy, didn't he buy the property? It was a builder, went out of business, another builder buys it, and trees got cut down by both parties, and it was kind of a,
Squirrely deal. Technical term.
it was an odd deal. We're talking the one on Goodall, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a strange deal, as I remember.
Well, yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the particular owner, I don't know if they still own the property, but I do believe they were aware of the policy.
No, they were aware of it.
Yeah.
Definitely, yeah, because they came in and testified
Yeah.
in front of us. But it wasn't like it was a weird deal, but.
Well,
Point
I had a
number
similar-
2, can we go on to number 2?
Well, I just had one comment on what you just said wasn't there this issue in Skylands last year or the year before where someone went in and cleaned it
Yes.
out? Our police went there, but I think it was a county site, is that correct?
Yeah.
There was a
Well,
big
that was
hullabaloo.
something
That
different.
was
something
actually
different.
in the city.
That was something different. That
Yeah.
was theft.
Yeah.
Theft,
Yeah,
okay.
that was a violation of the city's tree code. The tree removal was on a property that was in the city limits.
Was in city, yeah.
The adjacent property owner, who was not in the city, had hired someone to come onto the city property and remove the trees. And so it's interesting then, right, because the tree removal was not from the unincorporated property who may want to annex someday. It was from a property that's already in the city. So
Okay,
talk
thank you.
about your unusual cases.
Criminal case.
There's always going to be an exception to every ordinance and whatever, and people
And
who
always.
violate. I mean, I think we need to look at this from the macro viewpoint and say, you know what, how do we want the city to move forward? And we can't make policy for exceptions, although this was the original policy was created by somebody who did a big violation, and I can see what happened. And I think it prevented a lot of other people from violating or trying to do the same thing. So I think it's good policy. But I don't think we should try to make
Hammer it
policy
all.
for one individual homeowner, property owner that may get a slight break or whatever. It's how do we want this to go forward so that we can try to make everybody that wants to come in know the rules. So
I just did the math on the 170 per inch, so if we had a 30-inch Doug fir that you said is a significant tree, it would be $5,100 for one tree that was removed at 170 per inch. So that's not 170 is it. It's, you got to go through the inches, so something to think about. Is that good or bad?
So,
next one.
okay. So the next item has to do with the mitigation requirements. This should be quicker and a little more straightforward. So the current mitigation requirements require that, and this is just for tree removal. This doesn't have to do with resource alterations. You have to mitigate for the removal by planting a tree of the same or similar species, 15 to 20 feet tall, and with a trunk size of 5 to 12 inches caliper DBH on the same property in approximately the same location as the removed tree. So there are 3 issues that staff has identified with this. The first one is the size of the mitigation trees. So at 5 to 12 inches in diameter, you can source those types of trees, but they are a bit harder to come by. They require a much larger planting area because they have very large root balls. and they don't have as good a survival rate as smaller trees. And so if we're really trying to look to get a replacement mitigation, in there for those trees, a better option may be to require smaller but more trees. And so there's a couple of ways you could do that. You could just have a fixed mitigation ratio, so you could require, for instance, 3-to-1 mitigation with 3-inch caliper trees. Or you could base it on the number of caliper inches removed. And so if you removed, say, for instance, 2 30-inch Doug firs, you would be required to plant 3-inch calipers to trees to equal the 60 inches removed, which would be 20 3-inch caliper trees. Probably they're not going to be able to fit all those trees on the site. I would be less concerned with that because you could still put an option in that said that they could pay into the tree fund of $139 per tree for the trees that they can't fit on the site. So there would still be a financial deterrent in that because they would have to obviously pay for the trees that they couldn't fit on the site, but you would also be getting more trees and trees that could be more viable in the long term. Does the council have any thoughts or feedback on that?
Councilor Lamont?
So a couple months ago, when Director Siegel came in with the changes and new incentives and refinements for Boone's Ferry, I think we tried to even out the caliper to 3 inches. Was that correct? From 2 to 3? So that was that area, or is the whole city, the mitigation tree is 3?
No.
No.
In the Lake Grove, and I think West Lake Grove, it's 3-inch caliper, but the tree code requires 1.5-inch caliper or 6 foot tall for evergreen, 1.5-inch caliper for deciduous. So it's still larger than the tree code, but.
And I take your comments on the 5 to 12 seriously, because it is tough. I mean, they look great, and you got a nice big tree, but are they going to make it? And sourcing them is not that easy. But I think the 1.5 has always thrown me. Can we just have one policy through the whole city that anytime you're dealing with anybody, whether they're out or in the city, it would be 3 inches and a decent tree going in, and it'll hopefully root out and catch. So
Yeah,
we're not
so-
saying you're a half, you're an inch and a half, you're 3 or 2, just one city policy.
Well, there is a good reason to have a smaller mitigation, for instance, for the tree code. And this is something that the ad hoc tree committee took up in the 2017 update. And they actually, it used to be 2-inch caliper, and they reduced it to 1.5-inch. And the reason for that is because, again, better survival rate, the smaller trees that you plant. But also, some of our native trees, such as Oregon white oaks, are very, very difficult to find in 2-inch caliper or larger. So by reducing it, you increase the likelihood that these types of trees, which we want folks to plant, will be more readily available and planted.
I mean, not to put you on a spot, but would it be easier for staff to have the one caliper for the whole city for mitigation? Or is it 6 1/2 dozen, just whatever
Yeah, I
zone
mean,
you're in?
we are so well-versed in the tree code and what comes in LGVC that for staff, it's not a big issue. Yeah. So any thoughts on the size of
I think we're good.
trees? The recommendation to have the more but smaller caliper inches?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And any preference to whether it's the caliper inches removed or whether it's a fixed mitigation rate, such as 3-to-1 mitigation?
Councilor Kohoff?
So I think with climate change, all these trees are going to need water. So whether you have a 3-inch tree or even mature trees anymore, we're going to all have to get used to watering. And I don't have any particular thoughts about what size, if the 3 inches is the most sensible, I'm fine with that. It doesn't sit well with me that we're only charging $139, however, into the tree code for a tree. And I recognize that that was what the fee was in other places, and you were carrying that over to this particular situation. But I think that's a ridiculously low fee.
Right, just
$139.
remember, this would apply in addition to the restoration fee. So if 2 30-inch trees were removed and it was the standard fee, that's $5,400 fine, plus if they had to plant 20 mitigation trees and they could only fit 5, then they would have to do 15 times 139 in addition to the restoration fee.
I got that. I'm just serious. I'm not okay with $139 for the tree.
Okay.
And I'm still not happy with the Goodall Road thing either, but I would hope that we keep thinking about that. At least you know that some of us are still not convinced that that's a sin that we want to forgive without something.
Councilor Woodland?
I like your idea of the $139, and I mean, if you want to change that amount, I'm less inclined, but I do like the idea of giving giving options for people to deal with, and then basically, if we put money into the tree fund, we're going to plant trees, so it may not be on their property, but it will be somewhere in the city of Lake Oswego that will be planting trees. So I think that's the overall goal that we have, is to continue to replace trees. And I don't necessarily think it should be a punitive mechanism, because then you have people that will somehow make trees disappear at night, or, you know, things, if it gets too prohibitive, I think we need something that will work. And I do know that the unfortunate thing is that people oftentimes will plant trees or plant replacement things and then purposely put it in a place where they don't think it will succeed. And so if you make it a policy where people are pissed off at it so bad, they're going to try to make it fail. And I think your ideas on here are, you're giving people options, and they're going to mitigate cost and effort, and figuring out what their best options are for their property. And regardless of whether they plant 20 3-inch caliper trees or 5 and pay the extra $1,500 on top of the $5,500, I think we're still going to be planting 20 3-inch caliper trees at the end of the day in Lake Oswego. And personally, if we plant them, we're going to put them in great spots. We're probably going to put them where there's enough water and success rate, and we'll have a better, I would say, outcome of growing trees, and we're going to more, we'll be fulfilling more of the intent of the policy of preserving trees and restoring trees. They are a renewable resource, and if you just keep planting more and more trees, we will have bigger and bigger tree canopy in Lake Oswego. So I think overall your suggestion on that is right on from my perspective.
And just to clarify, so are you suggesting that we keep the option of either planting the larger trees 5 to 12 inch at 1-to-1 ratio, or doing the other options, or?
Yeah.
Or,
I mean,
okay.
Yeah, I mean, I hey, it's 2 sentences of ink. It's not going to cost much. And I think it's going to give homeowners or property owners some options to hopefully be successful. So I think your idea of mitigating sort of the risk of, I understand the difficulty of planting a large tree and having a successful replant, or whatever you want to call it.
Well, they're just very, very expensive.
And it's very expensive, right. But we also know that younger trees, if there's more of them, they have probably a better chance of something succeeding. So that's how the forest works. The strongest tree wins, so.
Moving on, okay. The next item is the, let me see here. Oh, it requires that the trees be located, be replaced in approximately the same location as the tree removed. The staff recommendation is that this should not occur, because if they're removing it for future development, then you're just setting up a situation where those trees have to be removed later. So the recommendation from staff is that we change it to require it to be located within a required setback based on the comprehensive plan zoning, or in some other like undevelopable or restricted area on the property, such as sensitive lands.
Great
Sounds
catch.
good? Great.
Cleans that up.
And then finally, we'll just move on to just the routine things. Staff identified a number of code citations that need to be updated, because our code was reorganized and renumbered, so we have bad code citations in there now to sensitive lands code. And also to update the reference to the Lake Oswego Natural Resources Inventory Update map. This was something a map that we had before we did the update to the sensitive lands map in 2015, so just refer to the sensitive lands map. And then updating the reference to the 5-inch western yew, which is one of the trees, if you remove it, it would be subject to this policy, to be 6 inches, because that's the size we regulate trees now. We don't regulate them at 5 inches anymore. And I think that's it. So those are just pretty routine. Unless you have any objection to that, we would recommend that that be updated as well.
Good cleanups.
And anything else for staff to look at? Okay,
Good.
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well done as always. Thank you. Do you dream trees at night?
Fortunately, no.
Good.
We are at 5.2, pavement management. Mr. Goodman was thinking about having a band here, but
Well, we've had plenty of conversations over the last few days, so. Good evening, Council President O'Neill and Council. My name is Joel Komarick. I'm with the Engineering Department, and with me this evening is my co-presenter, Gabe Kropp. Gabe is a Project Delivery Manager with Murray Smith, local consulting firm that Council assisted in bringing on board a couple of years ago to basically bolster staff's resources and help us implement a much more aggressive pavement management program than prior years. So if you recall, last year about this time, Gabe and I made a presentation to you, giving you an update on the first year of our program and some of the accomplishments that we achieved. And we're back again doing it for this year as well. So with that, I'll go ahead and start our presentation. I've got a few slides here, and I'm going to go through maybe the first half dozen, and then I'll turn it over to Gabe to finish up. So again, thought it would be worthwhile to just refresh you all and our audience on the program background and how we're organized. The work completed to date, and this would be a cumulative assessment of work completed to date, so the first year plus this last summer's work, kind of where we are with program costs to date, and then at that point I'll turn it over to Gabe to talk about the results of our most recent pavement condition assessment that was done this year, and some of the work that we're planning for this coming summer and a few of the summers in the out years. So with that, you're all aware that Council prioritized pavement maintenance as one of its goals back in 2016. Wanted to try and achieve a pavement condition index number of 70 by 2021, so that was staff's marching orders, and part of the reason why we put together the team that we have to be able to achieve that goal. And then we started to work we brought Murray Smith on board in November, I think, of 2017, and immediately jumped into the planning and design work for the summer 2018 projects. Again, just to kind of a organizational chart, shows how we're put together, the team is, but I will say that there could be dozens more boxes up there. This is really a cast of thousands effort. We don't plan which streets we're going to pave without getting feedback and input from our Public Works Department. So we try and honor our commitment to the dig once policy, where we don't go out and pave a street and then dig it up because we forgot that there's an old pipeline underneath that needs to get fixed. So we engage regularly and consistently our Public Works folks in the field to understand where we might have issues that are under the ground that need to get fixed before we pave a new street. And then, of course, our citizens, we hear a lot from them about their streets that they live on, and so we also take that into account when we're planning our year's paving work. So this is the work that we've completed to date. So in red, you see our rehabilitation projects. That's typically where we would go out there with a big machine and grind off some or most of the existing pavement, and then overlay or inlay that section with brand new pavement. And then we also intertwine that with our CIP projects. So it's not just pavement maintenance, but it's also addressing our larger capital improvement needs. So that street in blue, if you may recall, was Jefferson Parkway that was completely rehabilitated in the first year of our program.
This isn't slurry, this is the resurfacing, right?
Oops, sorry, I gotta figure out, whoop, I'm going wrong way. How do I go backwards, Anne Marie?
Well, I thought there was a backwards button.
There we go, sorry. Your question again, Councilor Lamont?
This isn't the slurry projects, this is the resurfacing, correct?
Correct. This is rehabilitation and CIP. There's no slurry that shows on this map. We did attempt, we put together a slurry project for this last summer. We only got 2 bids, and both of them were extremely high, so we rejected them all. But we're kind of approaching that a little bit differently this year in hopes that we'll get more contractor interest. So one of the things that we're competing against with our city's pavement management program is the fact that almost every other local community and city around here is doing the same thing, and we're all competing for a limited pool of contractors, particularly those that do the slurry seals and the crack seal. There's like, what, two, three out there. So they're competing for a lot of work, and they're going after the work that they think has the best margin for them in terms of profit and productivity. Program costs to date. Back in 2016, 2017, we were kind of targeting an expenditure of a little over $21 million to get to our PCI target. We've spent approximately half of that, but we're going to spend significantly more over the next couple of years due to a variety of reasons. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Gabe, and he can talk about our recent pavement condition assessment and the results and what that portends for the future. So, Gabe?
Thanks, Joel. Yeah, this last spring, we conducted a pavement condition assessment. The city does this approximately every 3 years. And so the graph up here shows how that PCI has tracked over the course of time with each of our surveys that we've done. So you can see in 2019, we are continuing to head in the right direction with some of the investments that we're making. And this survey was conducted by one of our subconsultants, Capital Asset Pavement Services. They've done this survey in the city the last several times. And they've put together a report that describes what you're seeing here in a little bit more detail. I think the executive summary was made available as part of the packet to you all in advance of this meeting. So the extended version of that report is also available and provides more detailed information, kind of breakdown of how they got to these numbers, if that's of interest to anybody. So you can see we are making progress and already approaching the initial goal the council laid out of getting to 70. This next graph is similar, but looking forward instead of looking backwards. At the top there, the blue line shows what the projected PCI will be based on the current projected funding and outlay that we have as part of the program. Down at the bottom, the red bars are an added element. That is an item that shows what the deferred maintenance is each year. Shows us kind of chipping into that as we go, but then again, increasing a bit in the out years.
So that's an aggregate number that carries from year to year?
Correct,
Okay,
yes.
so it's not an addition of its total what it would be?
Right, and you
Okay.
can see how that goes down, generally speaking, as the PCI goes up, which would make sense. As you approach an ideal target of around 80 to 84 or so, your deferred maintenance essentially would go to zero if you ever reached that point in time. So one of the things I wanted to point out is you do see a 73 actually at the beginning at 2020. And part of the reason for that is it really accounts for 2 years worth of work. So our conditions survey was completed at the beginning of 2019. So that assumes work that happens in the summer of 2019 plus 2020. So those numbers up there would be the resultant number at the end of that calendar year.
So it's really would be twice 19 million if you took 2019 and 2020?
The result of the work in 2019 and 2020 is what gets you
It's
to the
19, okay.
73.
Got it.
So as you can see there, we're tracking pretty high to a 76, as high as a 76 in 2022, and that's because we do have significant funding we're planning on investing in 2020, 21, and 22. And that would conclude the end of the program as it's currently set up. And so after that, funding would reduce back to something that's a little bit more typical. And as you can see, part of the risk that we need to be aware of is in the out years that you may actually end up reducing a little bit down from the peak at the end of the program. So something to be aware of for the future once we get through that work. Next, wanted to talk a little bit about what we're planning to do in 2020 as a means to get there. So this map shows a few different things. In blue, first, is the one CIP project we have planned on Wembley Park Road to be constructed next year. That's a CIP project because it's going to be a full reconstruction. It'll include some additional stormwater work as well. So a little bit more than our typical annual paving work. In red, you'll see those are the streets that we're currently planning to pave. So you may recall last year when we presented, we had a plan to kind of work in different geographies of the city. And this year, or I should say in 2020, was the plan to kind of cover the Fan area in particular. In addition, we added Stafford Road on the south side of town as an important arterial that was approaching the right time to have some grind and repair and overlay work as well. So in addition to that, the streets in green are ones we're hoping to slurry seal. As Joel mentioned recently, we were unsuccessful in getting those out because of high bid reasons this year, so we're hoping to carry those forward. The ones on the south side of town are the streets we are hoping to carry forward to next year. And we're currently working on the ones that we would like to do surrounding the Fan neighborhood. So that's why that whole area is shaded green right now, is we don't have the specific streets identified yet. We're in the process of doing that as we speak.
I saw your staff out there painting and finding cracks and looking at webs of cracks, and they're very thorough, by the way.
Good, they're doing their job. So we'll have more information to share on that as we work through the rest of the design process. We'll share that also publicly as with information flyers as that.
May I ask, Stafford, you're taking that all the way down to McVeigh, short of Highway 43? Is that correct?
Yes, I believe there's a
The
newer
lakefront.
pavement as you get closer
To
down.
the Lake Corp,
Yes.
more or less, where the pavement is?
Yeah, if you recall, when we did the big pipeline, came out on from Erickson onto 40, or McVeigh and then down, so we repaved that whole section.
Gee, that pipe?
Yeah.
Yes, I do recall that. And quickly in this, is there thought, would this be a part of the dig ones, sidewalks or other accoutrements or pipes within that project, or is this simply pavement?
This is simply paving work.
Okay,
Yeah.
great, thank you.
One other street that's not shown up there that we think we're also likely going to be moving forward with is Blue Heron Road. And so that's one that we've known about for a while that's needed some help. So we're talking about including that one, I believe, as well, right, Joel?
Yeah, I'll just kind of qualify that a little bit by saying we looked at that a couple of years ago because it isn't on our CIP, and it has been for some time. It's a challenging little stretch of road to do something with for one reason, because it's a long dead-end street, very narrow, a lot of grade change between the upslope and the downslope side, so drainage is going to be very challenging, and these types of reconstruction projects that we do typically also require that we address storm drainage along with them. We've been having some internal discussions about the cost of that and the relative to the number of folks that use that, and whether or not there would be some wisdom in doing something similar to what we did on Lakeview Boulevard this last summer, where the street is in such bad condition it presents a safety concern. So we are talking about maybe doing kind of a Band-Aid approach on that while we allow our stormwater fund to recover enough money to be able to fund the long-range improvements, kind of, again, like we did for Lakeview. They're just such huge, complicated projects that are being kind of held back because of our stormwater revenues. So we're thinking we might do something there that would be temporary in nature, maybe a 4 to 5 year kind of an overlay. But we haven't made that decision yet. We're just talking about it, so.
Thanks. And last thought on this slide is part of the goal is to kind of get in, out of the fan and out of the fan in 1 year, and hopefully have all of the streets more or less in a similar higher pavement condition. Knowing that there's broad needs across the whole area, we didn't want to try to overly impact the neighborhood more than one construction season. So trying to get it all done at once, kind of rip off the Band-Aid approach, so to speak.
And then Councilor Mans asked about the other things that might go with it. With,
Councilor Mans has another question.
oh, you go first then.
Thank you. Sorry, it was cute. Come on, that was
It
cute.
was?
Yeah, I thought so. My question is this: I know that there are roads within Lake Oswego that are lightly traveled, that are in poor or worse condition. Are those included in the PCI number?
Absolutely, yeah, when we choose the streets that we want to pave, we are taking a harder look at the arterials, roadways in particular.
Right. So in other words, an arterial or a heavily traveled street, even a neighborhood collector, for example, this PCI number is being impacted. I'm thinking of one street in particular that's long, alligatored, rutted, but really only sees a very small number of cars for the people who live up on top of a hill. But would be a very, very expensive street to rehabilitate, I would think, given its length. But that is going to impact our PCI number, correct, because of its condition?
Correct, I think I know what street you're referring to.
You probably do. I don't want to name names, I don't want to get anyone excited, but, okay, I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's very much a factor. So that, the reason Stafford is on there is because of the arterial use. It isn't necessarily a low PCI street, but it's so important that
It's
important
heavily
to
used.
take it, yep.
To my colleague, thank you for being so gracious.
Yes. So my comment is, and we've talked about this many, I get it, yeah. It comes up Councilor O'Neill, though.
You guys are button readers.
We've talked about this for probably 3 or 4 years. Director Rooney did an excellent presentation to a goal session of the council before I got on about the need for getting control of our right-of-ways, because we have 50 different things going on in one street. So there's the rural look, but we don't really have much of that rural look anymore. Flintstone rocks, boulders, parking, no parking, flowers, hedges. And the other day, I think we got after somebody to get the hedges out. So the comment I meant is especially in first edition, when it's 50 different things going on in one block, we're getting sooner than later, I think, and Eric and I have talked about this, of getting some guidelines together. So if somebody is renovating their house or building new, they should go to the guidelines, say, here's the 3 things you can do in the right-of-way, not anything you want. Especially when it comes to drainage, pedestrian access, biking, parking, the whole thing. We hear parking complaints, and then people put boulders in their parking space. So it's just something to keep in mind. I know we're just surfacing, we're not rebuilding, but it's something to think about sooner than later, and I think we just need to get on it and make it easier for engineering and planning to implement that. Okay, because it goes back to, are we doing anything else for paths or trails? Well,
Yeah, no.
not now.
So as the design firm, I can tell tell you, we're actually having a 50% design review meeting with city staff here soon. A lot of those topics are gonna be discussed in those meetings. Typically speaking, with the scope of this type of a job, we're trying to limit it as much as we can to the paving work, so we don't get the contractor too distracted from the production work that we need to get completed.
So we direct our comments to Mr. Komarick, I take it, right?
For the time being, yes.
All right. Next, wanted to touch on the next steps as well in 2021 and 2022. So there's a significant amount of work we have planned for those years as well. One CIP project that we're currently going to be looking at is Meadows Road. So this would be the full stretch from Bangi to Carmen through that commercial area. There appears to be some sinking manholes and general pavement distress that's kind of throughout the entire roadway for that whole stretch. And so we're going to be doing an investigation and a study this next spring to size that up a little bit better and see if what the right solution is there, and hopefully implement that solution, I think, in '22. And then outside of that, we'll have our typical annual paving and slurry seal work in '21 and '22 as well. And with the additional funding that Joel referred to earlier, there's a little bit of an update that we need to make to our prior plan, because our prior plan assumed a lesser amount of funding. We're going to try to apply more funding, so we need to take a fresh look at what are the best streets for us to pave with those additional funds. So we're hoping again next spring to have an update to that to best leverage those additional funds. So for instance, the construction budgets you can see there, approximately 8.1 million in '21 and 6.3 in '22. I think we're at 7 point something in 2020 as well. So that's the bulk of the program we're talking about, is 2020 to 2022 to do all that paving work.
Question?
Councilor Wedlin?
I'll get in the budget questions later, but I've noticed that, like, you repaved Upper, and it's beautiful and everyone loves it, and people are just, unfortunately, people drive a lot faster on it. But that being aside, somebody goes and gets a permit, builds a house, they have to dig through. What is our requirement? Do we have a city standard with which to return the pavement in its condition as before? Because it doesn't seem like that's always the case. After 6 months, it starts to see, so I don't know. Is that just an issue of development?
Well, it's one of those issues we try and anticipate. So one of the things we do as part of our due diligence when we're planning for streets is we find out who might be building. Does somebody know there's a lot that's been cleared and somebody might be building something, so we can try and anticipate those and avoid those, onesie, twosie pavement cuts. We can't always do that.
Right.
But what we do is after we've paved a street, we put it on our GIS maps and we call it a moratorium street, which means for the next 5 years, if there is a pavement cut in that newly paved street, the restoration requirements are quite a bit more comprehensive. Rather than just a trench patch, they actually have to go out so many feet on either side of that cut and either pave an entire lane for that full width or maybe both lanes. It just depends. But it's I don't want to call it onerous, but it just reflects the fact that we've got a newly paved structure there. We want to bridge that pavement cut with identical structure. So it's a much wider and bigger project to restore that trench cut.
Okay, thank you.
Question. So in your report, you're talking about our sources of funds, which are many, and we are always trying to juggle. The bond that we just passed was to monetize the money we're getting from the 2017 transportation plan, and I get that. But then we also talked to Tab the other night about the roughly $700,000 that is coming in eventually in 2020 from the VRF, the vehicle registration funds. And we are really short on funds for paths and trails. And as you know, the Transportation Advisory Board and the department are trying to get priorities on what are the key paths and trails are missing, because that is a goal we set in January, but also an emphasis on safe routes to schools. Not going to the feds for safe routes to schools, because we don't want to go that route. But getting this more priority, we know we're not going to get them all on the list, but I think as you guys go through these, if you just keep checking with Erica, that as this thing evolves, and we may need to check it with the school district and, you know, bus drivers and neighborhood chairs, here's a 5 or 10 project list that it may hit one of your roads at the same time, and see if we can find funds out of VRF or somewhere to at least get a sidewalk or path in there. It's coming up more and more, not only the high school kid that got hit the other day, but it just keeps coming up in our emails and our responses out there. Right. So if we can sync that up with you as we gear up to 2020, we may find the luck to try and put two together in one project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
Thank you.
All right. So with that, I was going to take a step back and just recount kind of where we've been with this program, where we started and where we're going today. So initially, when we were brought on board, the program was envisioned as a 4-year program, approximately 22 million, and kind of just using available funds that were to the city with the hope that new funds may become available over the course of time. And I think to a large extent that's happened. So today, in talking with the city, one thing that's been done is 1 year has been added to the program to help get us that much closer to that goal. We're now at about 49 million, according to our latest program budget tracking tool. It includes the bonded money from the House bill as the lion's share of that extra amount. So had a market increase in our ability to be able to get that PCI up, which is really good news. And here's the budget sheet. So as I mentioned, we do have a tracking tool. It's a little bit more of a behind-the-scenes tool where we have a lot more detail supporting the numbers that you see here. But this is kind of a summary of all the different task orders or projects that we have that we're managing under the program. So as we said, saw on a slide before, we've spent about 10 million, but we still have a long march to go to get to the total 50 million that you see up there. So this is a summary of various elements. There's management time for managing the program. There's pavement planning to kind of plan ahead for what streets we want to do. There are CIP projects up there, and then there's the annual paving work. That annual paving work also includes the slurry seal and crack sealing work as well. So probably the notable thing there, again, I'll say is that in 2020, 21, and 22 are the years where the most money is being planned to be spent. So starting next year, you're going to see a lot more work going on, and you'll see that throughout the whole fan. The fan will certainly feel the most pressure of anywhere else in the city for next year, and we'll see what it means for 21 and 22.
We need a big block party after it's done, like a big one. Fully neighborhood-wide, you know?
Yep. So with that, I'll turn it back to Joel for the last slide in terms of what that means, kind of for the remainder of the program.
Yeah, well, it means more work zones, temporary traffic disruptions, but improved pavement condition, and that really is the objective here, is to get us closer to that PCI number that allows us to spend less money in keeping our roads in good condition. But as Gabe mentioned, it takes a lot of, it's going to take a lot of planning and effort and patience by the community because next year's program is going to be significantly, markedly larger in scope, geographic scope. The slurry seals are always a challenge in this community because of our tree cover. That was one of the issues that we heard about from contractors. It provides so much shade on the roadway that the slurry seal doesn't cure in a day, and people want to get back to their homes the same day, and so we try and limit the amount of time they can put that product down on the roads to give it enough time to cure so that when people come home at 5 or 6 o'clock, they can actually get into their cul-de-sac or street or whatever. So those are always very challenging. But we're up to it, and we've made good progress, and we'll continue to make good progress. Next month, I'll be coming back in front of council with some requests to kind of replenish our funding source for our consultant team. And then, of course, we'll have a number of construction projects that'll be bidding later this year, early next year, for the summer 2020 work. So with that, Gabe and I are done with our presentation and happy to answer any more questions that you may have.
Counselor Wedlin?
So on the money part, the last, in our numbers, our packet presentation, we have a table 1 that has summary of outcome of different funding levels. So I don't know if there's a slide for that or not, but there's 3 different scenarios, 1, 2, and 3, costing different amounts of money from 18.1 million to 59.7 million. So I guess my question is, we've funded 49.4 at this point, so we have funding for that all established and budgeted and all the different sources. In order to get to the 59.7, we would have to come up with another roughly $10 million to get to a index of PCI after 5 years of 84. Is that correct?
Close to correct. So the 60 million that you see there would be a one-time cost if you were to implement everything all at once immediately. In this case, we're doing it over the course of time. So it might end up being slightly more than the 10 million because of the multiple years it takes to get there. And then you would, because you'd have your normal maintenance cost on top of that one-time cost on a year-to-year basis. So perhaps more like 15 to 20 million, but generally speaking, you're close, yes.
So, and I don't know, I guess the budget discussion is maybe another day. Okay. I think it's a great update. I think we're making progress, but I think you also told us in a previous presentation that if you don't act now, your PCI continues to decrease and the degradation of your current paving and current roads goes at a steeper curve down, and it costs you more to get it back up. So really the idea is for us to be putting a lot of money up front to ensure that we don't have a degradation of our index in our roads. Is that correct?
It is, yeah, and that, in the one slide that we showed, maybe I can get back to it.
You showed him the life cycle of a street, didn't you? You showed him that overlay.
You kind of see it here. When we go back to more typical levels of funding, you see what happens to the deferred maintenance.
Right.
So.
And you're just building that red column up farther and farther each year. So you really need to hit it hard. So then your little bar of red becomes smaller and you stay on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
And from a slurry standpoint versus a, whatever you call it, a reconstruction or real repavement, what's the cost difference? And what's the, so is that kind of like doing a Band-Aid, or it is?
A slurry seal is like a tenth of the cost of like an overlay.
Right, but you can, I mean, a tenth of the cost, but a slurry can last 5 or 10 years?
It can typically last, 7 or 8 years if you apply it to a street that is appropriate to, but it has to be a good condition street to begin with, right?
Right.
That's the idea.
Because I noticed some of our streets have a number of cracks and whatever, and I in California, I've seen them put kind of like a tar or something just on the cracks.
Crack sealing. Mm-hmm.
Crack sealing. Mm-hmm. What's the difference? I mean, is that like even a tenth of the tenth of? I mean, is that just a cheap way of keeping things? I tend to see those in county roads.
Yeah,
versus-
we're actually going to plan to do both crack seal and slurry seal this next year. So
Okay.
we'll fill in the cracks first to help prevent water from getting into the roadway. Then we'll do a slurry on top of that.
So that gives you the double protection sort of having a
Right.
longer life. Okay, so. Well,
Counselor Lamont?
I just learned recently from our Transportation Advisory Board meeting, Director Rooney mentioned that our local improvement district, our LID tool that has been rarely used, cannot be used, and correct me if I'm wrong, Erica, for minor arterials. Is that correct, or only for local roads?
Correct, the way the program was set up was correct.
Yeah.
Joel actually knows the answer, but yes, that's correct. I said the other night that it's only for the local roads, not for anything above. That's the way we set it up a couple of years ago.
So not to worry about it or discuss it now, but it's something I think we need to look at, not only for our streets, if somebody wanted to move up the line and do something with their neighbors, but also as an incentive for annexation, because somebody annexing in doesn't go right to the top of the capital improvement program. They got to be seen and assessed by engineering and then figure out where they go. But they could come in for a local improvement district, and we have the 50/50 program as well. So when I found that out, some of our bigger roads in the unincorporated areas aren't eligible for LID. So it might be something you want us to revisit after you kind of go through it again. If 20 people want to line up and help get the road going, why wouldn't we do it? And I'm thinking of Atwater.
They've never come in wanting to do it.
No, but they're talking about it, though. So my point is, they can't do it now, because you can't do a lid on a minor arterial, is that correct? Or a collector?
It's just for local roads.
Yeah.
And for local roads that have a PCI of less than 50. And it applies to roads that require reconstruction, not an overlay or an inlay.
Right.
But reconstruction. So then that triggers stormwater.
Right.
And
But the point of it is a tool that we don't use. I think Anthony and I have talked about this, it's a tool that doesn't get used. So let's say we finally get 4, 5, 6 big property owners together on Atwater. The street is really messed up. Oh, sorry, you can't do a lid because you're not a local street, even if they were incorporated into the city. If it was another level up, a collector, a minor arterial, could we do that? That's what I'm asking.
Well, let's clarify. The program we did a couple years ago that we implemented was very specific about sharing only half the cost of construction only.
Right.
There's still the formal, correct me if I'm wrong, Councilor Powell, there's still LIDs as can be used for all sorts of things, and they could do that approach, which is they pay for the cost of everything.
Oh, okay, so
that's
lids can
still
do any
there.
street.
You could do lids for lots of things, sewer,
Okay.
water,
But
roads,
also the
everything.
bigger streets?
Yes, you
Okay,
could.
so 50/50 is only for local.
It's only what we put
Gotcha.
out there as a carrot for small local streets in that very specific
Got it,
kind of
'cause
scenario.
we need incentives for our unincorporated folks to come on in. So, yeah, anything that could be adjusted there that might be needed, let's look at it. Okay.
any other questions?
Great presentation.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Appreciate your attention. We'll be back next year. Gabe will. I might not.
Great progress.
You mean, are you retiring again or something?
For the second.
No. I think once you get here, you never leave. Isn't that Lake Oswego's way?
Okay, council business, 6.1 was moved to our November 5th meeting, okay?
Move we accept the consent agenda, 7.1 and 2 and 3.
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Information from council.
I have some.
All right.
I'll make it quick. Well, as I announced last time, I did attend the Regional Water Partnership, which our Carrie Duncan also was there, and much was discussed about our regional resiliency, as it often is. I believe Ms. Duncan will be presenting on the Water Partnership depreciation in December, I think, something like that. In any event, I don't think I'm going to be at that meeting, but she'll be great. Also, wanted to remind folks that the Multi-City Equity Summit is this Saturday at Lake Ridge Junior High. Registration begins at 8 p.m. It will run throughout the day.
8 a.m.
I mean a.m., yeah, thank you. That would have been really good. 8 a.m., it'll run throughout.
8 at night?
The meeting will run throughout the day. Lunch will be served. There'll also be snacks. I've been told to throw that out there. Lunch is free. We have amazing speakers. We're going to have great breakout sessions, performance by local students. So I think we're going to have a fantastic day. Hope to see everyone there.
So it's Saturday, it starts at 8, and it's at where?
Lake Oswego Junior High. If I said Lake Ridge, I apologize. Lake Oswego High School.
It's the Lake Oswego School District Community Room, right?
Lake Oswego High School.
Lake Oswego High School, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I think I really honked that up.
Their auditorium or
It'll be auditorium and in the lunchroom, and breakout sessions will be in classrooms. And with luck, we will have everything extraordinarily well organized, and you'll be able to move around easily.
Great.
That's it.
Counselor Kohlhoff, did you have something?
I had a couple of things. I'm picking this up from Councilor Manns. But I'll make them quick because I'm sure that our mayor is listening and will want to make sure that we're not falling out of habit here. So a couple of things I did want to bring up. As part of being a counselor, we're often sent off places to other meetings, other city, regional, or state meetings. But also, as Councilor Manns has been bringing up, there are affinity groups putting on productions that we're attending, and they're very useful resources. So I bring to your attention the tree summit that came up not too long ago. It was actually spearheaded by the Lake Oswego Watershed Group and sponsored, in a sense, with the neighborhood associations. What the PowerPoints, if you weren't there, are now on the website. So that's a super good starting point. You don't have to agree with all of it, but it certainly was a concise and good start. I did want to talk to you a second about some other things, but I most definitely want to bring up that at MPAC, we were specifically asked to bring up the fact that there's going to be a meeting on October 22nd at 6 o'clock at the Abernathy Center, 606 15th Street. The point of this is to get the last of the citizen input about the types of projects that would go into Metro's 2020 Regional Transportation Funding Measure. So after the 22nd, then there is a vote with a smaller group, which goes to the T2020 Task Force, and then it goes to Metro itself, and it's the first part of December when Metro itself will vote on these projects. So this is kind of your last time if you're in Clackamas County. Washington is having one, Washington County on October 21st, and then Multnomah on October 24th. So I've done my duty.
Thank you.
To Metro and
Thank you.
Country.
Reports from officers?
Since she's still here, I want to note that Erica Rooney and Clayton Simon went out and met with the superintendent and some other folks today to talk about the intersection of Hazel and Country Club. And I think there's 5 or 6 little options that we're looking at, but I wanted to make sure you knew. Also, since Anthony's here, his staff have also been out there trimming trees to make sure that folks can see the flashing beacons. So I want you to know that we're trying to respond to the pedestrian safety issues at that intersection.
Thank you.
Somebody said that they think the flashing lights by the Safeway over to Duke's are too high, that they don't see them that
I
correctly.
think, that, Erica, do you want to come up? I think that you're working on that one too,
working on
yes?
I thought we talked about
You
that.
updated us already.
Yeah.
Lower on
Yeah, actually, the ones right here at Fifth and A is what you're talking about. Next week, we're scheduled with our Clackamas County Signals group to go out there and lower the beacon part of it to a lower, I don't know, maybe about 3 feet. So it should be at a better height for visibility for the drivers. The crosswalk will be uncontrolled, if you will, for 2 days, but I am going to keep it open, and we're going to be putting up caution signs for the pedestrians to say, signal's not on, cross with extreme caution, something like that. So it's still legal to cross because there's a lot of people crossing there, wanting to cross there, but they're gonna have to be extra cautious because the signal, the overhead stuff will be out. So next week, we're
But they
working on
could
it.
walk down to the next
They
signal.
can't always walk down there, and I always encourage
Either
people to
one,
go to the
either
signal.
way.
Yep, you certainly can. If you're uncomfortable, please go to the next signal.
So
That'll be next week for 2 days.
I don't know if you've looked into this or not, but we've had suggestions, and I've seen it in action, where there's a little bucket of
Yep.
flags on each side, and I don't know whether it works or not. I've seen it in different places that I've traveled to. I know that there's some of the seniors that are apprehensive about their mobility speed to get across that space, and if they had a flag,
We implemented the flags in Ashland, and I have to say the flags didn't last too long because people took them.
I figured they'd probably last for
People took them.
a month or two, and then they disappear. But
We've had them there multiple
Oh,
times.
okay.
They take off in they're for some reason attractive to people, or they don't make it.
Right. I'm sure they
go to the.
they're a
go to
good,
the-
they're a
go to
good
the-
prop for
They
somebody or
really,
something.
I don't know.
they work well in orderly countries.
They do work well for about 2 days. We are actually going to put them up during this particular closure so that people have something to help them. That's about how long they last. We've had them
Okay.
up even just this year. We had somebody help us with putting them out there, and boom, they were gone within days.
Right.
I don't know where they go, but they do. They take off.
The Fabulous Wine Walk had crossing guards.
Yes, great
And that was
idea.
very effective. It was a visible,
Yes.
tall man and cars with a sign, and cars stop.
Yeah, it's good.
Imagine that.
The best thing we could put there is a signal, but that has its drawbacks as well. And-
Sure.
And that certainly is not a cheap alternative, but maybe
Right.
someday there'll be enough traffic volumes on the side to, warrant that. But for now, yeah, we'll be putting flags up for next week that people can use in a bucket. We're getting that lined out. I'm working with Anthony's team is helping make some special signs for us. Clackamas County is going to be bagging the overhead so the drivers aren't confused, and we'll be doing that next week, so watch out for that.
I know it's kind of on the spot, but people have asked me, how's the City Hall project going? Is it all going well?
Yeah, it's going very well. We have had all kinds of interesting encounters, as you do when you dig a big hole, especially if you dig a big hole right about the time the rainy season starts. But it's moving ahead. I'm glad you brought that up because later this month, actually, there's going to be 2 days when we're pouring the concrete slab for the foundation. And the neighbors have been gracious in allowing us to pour the concrete quite early in the morning, so that construction work will start at 5 in the morning. But by doing this, we save tens of thousands of dollars. So we are grateful to the neighbors. And I think 24th of October and the 31st.
Nice.
I will also say, as someone whose office is next to the project, I really hope that we found the last of the boulders because it's quite noisy.
Right. The good thing is that you're right there, so you have a
Yeah, bird's eye
equal-
view, yeah.
equal hearing issue, as everyone else does, so. Right.
Basalt is very good, though, for seismic, so I'm happy that there's a lot of basalt in our
Yeah.
community. It's
No
good for
kidding.
us in the long run,
Yeah.
even though it's quite
It's a comfort.
irritating in the afternoon when you're trying to work.
Confidence level.
No, it's
Right.
the chink, chink, chink.
Chink,
sound.
chink, right.
Okay, I think we're adjourned.
Good work.
Great meeting. Way to.